All right, so let's stay with the theme of the G20 summit, but focus the attention on the BRICS members, of which South Africa is a part, and they'll be looking to advance the grouping's position. So let's understand how. And we speak now to the Institute for Global Dialogue Senior Research Fellow, Sanusha Naidu. Sanusha, good evening to you. Thank you very much for your time. Look, so let's start here at home. Does South Africa's BRICS membership advance its position in the G20?
Good evening, colleague. Good evening to your viewers. I think it does give South Africa some traction within the G20, because you must remember that the G20 is also made up of these different kinds of blocks. So in your insert, it was mentioned about the formation of the G20 that comes out of the 1997-1998 Asian financial crisis. But at that point, it was a ministerial G20. It wasn't a heads of state. And of course, after 2007, 2008, we saw what happened in the developed economies with the global financial crisis. And so you saw countries starting to move towards a much more broader compact or broader context of how to deal with the global governance architecture and the financial architecture in terms of crisis. And within the bloc, within the G20 itself, you have different types of state groupings. Like you have the BRICS, you have the G7, you also have smaller groupings like the India, Brazil, South Africa. You also have part of that includes members from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So to answer your question, it gives South Africa traction to also try and see how the alignment of issues can be taken forward, both from the sense of the BRICS and the summit that happened in Brazil this year as Brazil's presidency of the BRICS, but also it links to other areas of global governance concern and issues with regard to the financial, the economic, and the social dynamics of the global architecture. And that is what's currently happening in Belém in Brazil around the conference of the Party 30, the COP30 around climate change. So these are some of the dynamics in terms of going forward. But I think the real challenge or the real important point to really think about for this summit is the question of the consensus that you may have to get in terms of a declaration, or will we get a kind of high-level leader's statement?
Yeah, you talk about that declaration. The understanding is that a draft is already in place and there continues to be negotiations as we head to the weekend, which will basically be the climax, and we'll see how that results. Let me borrow a word that you have been using, Sanusha, and it is the dynamics. Is it too simplistic to look at this as the global north versus global south as we talk about the BRICS members and how they seek to advance their position in the G20?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes to a point right now where we are at an inflection within the international system. We are at a crossroads. We're not sure what this international system is going to look like. We've seen and we've heard words like unpredictability, uncertainty. We're trying to understand what the kinds of economic transactions and the economic engagements are going to impact both at the level of economic growth and, of course, the question of the debt vulnerability. And that was what's a big issue for South Africa. And so this issue about the debt suspension sustainability initiative, which goes back to the G20 in terms of trying to write off debt, which possibly, and I don't want to misquote this, but I also have to link it to my understanding around the issue of how do you write off debt that's historical to countries that are low risk, high risk, low income countries, or what we call highly indebted poor countries, the HIPC initiative and so forth. But this is about what debt servicing has done. And we've seen this in the context of the commissioned panel that South Africa has also put on the table in terms of inequality, the panel led by Professor Joseph Stiglitz. And so these are questions I think need to come back to how it aligns to the discussions that are happening both within the G20 and outside of the G20, bearing in mind that these are countries that are basically in both kinds of fora, whether it's the G7, whether it's the BRICS, whether it's in other fora era that I've mentioned. So I think the challenge right now around these issues with the G20 is how does it get to understand what this inflection point, how it addresses this inflection point, because we are seeing this challenge around debt vulnerability and what a coming crisis could look like in the context of the global economic architecture and the financial architecture.
Yeah. I was wondering, Sanusha, as you talk about this, that if we use the example of a push and pull factor, again, looking at the global north versus the global south, let's understand or remember that the BRICS nations, that grouping has since expanded. That's why it's now called the BRICS Plus. And it includes in there nations such as Iran. And that country really makes some countries in the north very uncomfortable. Are these part of the pull or push and pull factors that make it hard for it to find that, or to find either, I could say, resonance, or to find expression, perhaps is a better word to use, within this bigger grouping called the G20?
I would like to think that from a theoretical perspective, Iran is not in the BRICS, not in the G20, sorry.
Right.
And so your issues in the G20 is really around the fundamental structural flaws and design flaws in the international financial architecture and the impact that has on the kind of issues with regard to poverty, hunger, inequality, debt vulnerability, etc. So I think that is the juxtaposition, the push and pull around how this plays out in the G20. Now, Iran, I'm not saying that it's not a point. I think the question of the BRICS Plus is that in the BRICS Plus, you have countries like Saudi Arabia, which in a sense, we're still trying to get confirmation or understand that is it a BRICS Plus member, or is it still trying to define that? But it is also a member of the G20, and this comes back to questions around your price volatility around commodities, issues around critical minerals, etc. So you have countries that are actually sitting at this crossroads, at this inflection in terms of being part of the BRICS, but not in the G20. But then also thinking about whether or not you're going to have observer countries or invited guests, like you have with Norway, which is an invited guest to the G20. And so you have these kinds of dynamics within the BRICS. But right now, I think the real challenges within the G20 rather is this question around, are we going to deal with these very fundamental structural challenges around the global economy, but also remembering that climate change is now not just about environmental issues. It's becoming a bigger, more symptomatic and a deeper structural condition around how it impacts on food security, on poverty, on inequality. And that's a big question as well. And then you link that up with what's happening in AI and digital transformation.
Yeah, I want to go back to your earlier point about debt servicing costs. And I want to bring this now to the African context, or the continent of Africa, because this summit, as South Africa has billed it, is not only about South Africa, but it's about the continent at large. And so, in essence, this summit carries the hopes of the entire continent of Africa, because it is hosted in this country that is South Africa. How much advancements are going to be made, you think, in that regard, particularly when we talk about the debt servicing costs? I mean, I remember not too long ago, a country like Zambia was really at an inflection point, to borrow your words, when it comes to debt servicing.
Well, Kole, if you really contextualize what debt servicing looks like in Africa, and I'm not a debt analyst in that sense, but if you look at some of the reports that have come out, particularly from the African expert panel around what debt servicing looks like, I mean, it's almost, coming up to about 3/4 of countries' budgets that go towards debt servicing. I mean, I think we saw this in the context of South Africa's medium-term expenditure budget statement in terms of what debt servicing looks like, how much sense of the rand goes towards debt servicing, and then you look at that impact on countries like that like Zambia that depend on a commodity like copper and then get caught up in the currency volatility and the copper price volatility, and then you see how that impacts on debt. But it's not just debt; it's the interest on debt that is really crippling some of these countries in Africa. And I think that's going to be a very tough discussion in the G20, particularly because when you start to unpack debt, debt is not just about whether you owe a single nation money or whether you owe multilateral debt, like to your IFIs, or whether debt is now becoming a kind of commodity that gets bought in terms of commercialization of debt. So these are very intricate, very complex discussions, and the question is, what is going to be done to deal with this kind of the debt sustainability issue in the G20, because it is a very political debate as well. And I think this is where South Africa can actually find traction with the AU, with the African partners under the AU, because the AU is the second regional bloc in the G20, to try and find ways to start unpacking what this debt means for the African continent, particularly in terms of social services, in terms of what's going to happen to people's lives and livelihoods, because it has a mushrooming, snowballing effect.